Good evening, everyone. I am Helen Jays, the headmistress here at Manchester High School for Girls, and I would like to welcome everyone to our virtual Founders Lecture. Now, although we wish we were welcoming you to Manchester High School for Girls face to face, we are delighted that so many of you are with us this evening. I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be introducing to you our class of 1998 alumna, Anushka Asthana. Anushka read economics at St John's College, Cambridge, before going on to study periodical journalism at City, University of London in 2003. She has worked at The Observer, The Washington Post, The Times, Sky News, and currently she is editor-at-large at The Guardian and host of the daily news podcast at The Guardian, Today in Focus. She has also, since 2018, been a co-presenter on ITV's Wednesday night flagship politics discussion programme, Peston. If you do have any questions that you would like me to pose to Anushka, both during the presentation and at the end, please do post them in the chat section and I will ask as many as I can. So, welcome to Anushka. Thank you so much for being with us. We are really looking forward to hearing about your career to date.
Thank you very, very much for having me. When I was thinking about this, I couldn't quite believe that it is nearly 23 years since I left Manchester High. And this makes me sound really old, 36 years since I started there in Mrs. Foley's reception class. And when I was thinking about this event, a conversation came to mind from when I think I was a teenager. And I was sitting with my friend from school, Laura Class, and with her mum, Stephanie, who had also been to Manchester High. And actually 4 generations of Laura's family came to this school. And Stephanie told me that she made such great friends at the school that at her son's wedding, many, many years after she left, there were 4 of them together who had met in reception at Manchester High. That is quite something to still be so close to the people you met in a classroom aged 4. Now, I wasn't really thinking about the future at that time when she told it to me, but decades, I hate to say, since I sat in that classroom, guess what? I am also incredibly close to some of the girls, now women, who I met at the time. Among them are women who have been bridesmaids at my wedding, who are godmothers to my children, who I can call up out of the blue after not seeing them for years and who will instantly say, come round, stay with us, as recently happened with a friend in Geneva. Not that recently, obviously, because we can't travel at the moment. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Well, if I was in the hall with you right now, and I really do wish life was normal and I could be there, then I would ask those of you who are still at school to look around right now at the faces around you, at the girls you normally hang out with every day in the corridors of Manchester High, and know that those friendships are going to be some of the most enduring and I would say important part of your experience at this school. I wouldn't dare say that exams don't matter, not with many teachers listening, and of course they do, but I think it is not insignificant that I don't remember exactly what grades I got at Manchester High, but I do remember Roisin and Liz and Pam, Adita and Sunny, Laura, Lara, Rachel and many more. And so when I knew I was giving this talk, I went to all those old Manchester High friends and I asked them for their reflections on school and what advice they might give to their younger selves, knowing what they do now. And I have to say, chatting to them, we dived into such lovely memories of Manchester High. I'm sure it is very different right now, but Roisin McNeil and Liz Biggs, who were in my year, remembered Ms. Tong, who was our Latin teacher, marching us physically around the classroom and across the field, chanting "Sum est, sumus estis sunt." And they also remembered history lessons with Dr. Joy, who, instead of spending hours making us learn facts, brought the facts to the classroom in a booklet and got us to discuss, debate and argue. I didn't realise at the time how important those skills would come to be in my career. well, maybe not dressing up and reciting Latin grammar, but you know what I mean. And one thing I remember very well was an English language lesson with Mrs. Robertshaw, where we had to write a newspaper article. And to be honest, I never felt that English was my strength at school. Maybe maths and certainly sciences, biology, physics and chemistry. But in this lesson, she'd been quite impressed by my written work, and she said to me, "Have you considered doing English A-level?" And I genuinely laughed because I did not think that I could write. And to think then that just 10 years later, I would be starting a job on a national newspaper, I would not have believed it age 14. And later on in this, I want to reflect on the way I felt back then and what it meant for my career. But first, I just want to explain how I got to there and how I got beyond there. And then after that, I think we'll pause for some questions. And then I want to reflect a little on what Manchester High has meant to me and those friends who I mentioned when it came to our careers. And then finally talk a little bit about being a woman, and in particular a mother in the workplace and the challenges that poses. So look, I'm 40, which is a bit scary. Right now I'm at home here. I live on the outskirts of London. I live with my husband, Toby, who is currently wrestling our 3 boys, not literally to bed. Ethan, who's 8, Rory, who's 5, and 2-year-old Leo. I'm hoping that one of them will not barge in here. They have strict instructions. As Mrs. Jones was saying, I work for The Guardian as editor-at-large, which is a very grand-sounding title. But my main job, as she said, was to present our daily podcast, Today in Focus, which I love doing, and I'm hoping to get some more listeners tonight. Before that, I was political editor in a job share, and I'm going to talk about the importance of that opportunity later. Back when I was 14, in 1994, I lived with my parents and my brother in Staley Bridge. I got the 691 bus to school. I don't know if that still runs, but I sometimes feel like I have as many memories about what happened on that bus as I do from school itself. Memories that the teachers wouldn't want me to share, I have to say. We used to get such a telling off when we came into assembly. Now, I did not take Mrs. Robertshaw's advice. I actually took science A-levels that would keep the option of medicine on the table, just in case. I was a good Indian girl. But I did also take economics with Mrs. Wallace, who I found really inspiring. And although never overtly political, I do have one memory of, I think it was May the 2nd, 1997, arriving at school with a huge smile on her face, and I think a little pin which had a Labour rose on it. It was, of course, the day that Tony Blair got elected. I don't know if you'd be allowed to wear that today. I went to Cambridge, inspired by the economics and not the medicine, which I have to say was a strange and slightly overwhelming place, but I ended up loving it and made brilliant friends. But by the time I was 21, I had this great education and yet no real clue still of what I wanted to do with life. I knew that I enjoyed the media, so I stayed on for an extra year at university and I just did everything I could to get experience. So I worked as a floor manager on a student television show. I presented a student radio show. I worked on the student paper. Opportunities that you must grab if you want to be a journalist. And at the time I was thinking about trying to get into television production, but my friend Adita said, "Why don't you get some experience on a newspaper?" And so I did. And I have to say, I had no clue about the media world at that time. It felt very, very alien to me, as if there was like this giant brick wall surrounding the national papers. I had no contacts. So I just hit the phone. And on a side note, to illustrate how different the world was back then, I needed to get phone numbers for local papers, and directory inquiries was free if you called it from a payphone. I didn't have a mobile phone, of course. And so one day in the Arndale Centre with my mum, I remember spending about half an hour at a payphone, just calling 192, getting number after number, and then I just cold called people. I ended up doing work experience in Tameside in Greater Manchester at a local paper, and then in the New Statesman. And eventually, through a journalism course, which was mentioned, I got work experience at the Observer newspaper, which is where I got a really lucky break, mainly by just being ready to do anything that was asked of me, whether it was making tea, photocopying, sending off letters for the journalists. And then one day, the editor came to me and said they were running a story about 2 honour killings that had happened in Birmingham. and could I get a train up to Birmingham and speak to the bereaved families? I have to say, being asked to do a death knock, which is what they are called, age 22, on work experience in a different part of the country was absolutely terrifying. But I knew it was a really important story that we had to tell. And so I went and I knocked, and one family shouted a lot at me and then slammed the door in my face. And I remember just standing on that doorstep, sort of taking a deep breath, maybe crying a tiny bit. It was just awful. But then this second family wanted to talk, and I got an exclusive interview. The news desk was absolutely delighted, and I wrote it up with Jason Burke, who's a fantastic journalist, now the Guardian's Africa correspondent. And then the first brutal lesson of Sunday journalism. The Saturday Guardian had the same story, and my efforts came to nothing. The entire story was pulled. I have to say, I was absolutely gutted. Not one to give up, I waited it out for my next big assignment. I was so excited when the editor approached me again, wondering what hard-hitting Sunday investigative story he would ask me about this time. It started well. He said it was something undercover, but alas, he then said, would you mind going speed dating, which was a new dating trend, and they wanted an article on it. I have to say, it wasn't exactly going to win me a Pulitzer Prize, but hey, you take the chances that you get, and it was all worth it. I got a job at The Observer and had an absolutely amazing 8 years there as a junior reporter, doing many more dating stories, but then as education correspondent, acting health editor, deputy news editor. It was so varied. One minute I was sitting outside a house shivering in Liverpool, covering a story about a British victim of Al-Qaeda. And then suddenly I got a phone call saying, would you mind flying to Puerto Rico next week to cover a hip hop convention? So a bit mad. I quickly learned what areas I should not specialise in, like when my news editor suggested fashion, and I suddenly found myself in like the journalist pen of the red carpet outside the BAFTAs. I mean, to most people, this would be an absolute dream. But to me, I had to call in the outfits on display, and I literally could not recognise any of the famous actors. So I was sort of ringing in the desk, sort of as they went past, realising I'd missed my opportunity. But luckily, later politics arrived, and I knew that was for me. And actually, thinking back to those lessons with Dr. Joy and Mrs. Wallace, it was something I'd been interested in right from the start. And I actually think I got into it. I got into the lobby, as it's known. That's the journalists who have passes to Parliament, because I had gone for another job that was really out of reach. I had applied to be the South Asia correspondent at The Guardian, based in India. Jason Burke, who I mentioned, actually got that job. But I think by doing a good interview, being ambitious, putting myself out there, I got noticed, and instead I got this other job. So it is always worth aiming high. Now, before I tell you about covering politics in the UK, let me mention politics in America. I actually cover that quite a lot now, but not back in 2006 when I got this amazing opportunity to go and work on the Washington Post for a 3-month sabbatical. And I'm just going to show off for a second now, because while I was there, I got 2 unbelievably exciting assignments. One was to fly twice on Air Force One with George W. Bush, which was such a pinch yourself experience, especially when I was kind of running off the plane and running to jump into the presidential convoy before it raced off. It felt like I was on a television show. Although, to be honest, it was really scary as well. I was quite young. I felt out of my depth. You know, I had all these experienced American journalists, and I barely knew who the press secretary was. And then in another assignment, this lovely editor said to me, would you mind going to this local event and interview this rising star of the Senate, Barack Obama? And I tell you what, we didn't know then that he was going to run for president, but I was starstruck. He just had this aura about him. So off I went to interview him with my dictaphone and my super fast shorthand. And in this crowded lobby, I got 15 minutes with him. And then I rushed back to write it up. And when I got there, disaster struck. I realised that I had forgotten to press record on my dictaphone, and my notes were not quite up to it. I had lost the interview with Barack Obama. Cue massive panic. I have to say I was not laughing at the time, but lucky me, he wasn't quite as grand as he would go on to be. And his advisor took pity on me and sent me his recording of the chat. So it was all okay. Since then, I've worked in politics here in the UK at The Observer, The Times, Sky News, and now The Guardian, although my brief is much wider these days. And there have been some real pinch yourself moments here as well. None quite as good as Barack Obama, but still pretty cool. I've travelled all over the world with prime ministers and other politicians to Afghanistan, India, Australia, Brazil, Israel. I've covered 4 general elections, including at Sky News, trailing the Tory campaign around the country while heavily pregnant. I actually remember the final stint. David Cameron was doing this 36-hour straight stint. I was 8.5 months pregnant by that time. And so I wasn't going to do the whole stretch on his bus, but I do remember interviewing him in Asda, I think, at 2 a.m. And as you will know, if you've ever been pregnant, my mind was just mush. And I think I just had to stop at one point because I wasn't sure what else to ask. Another challenge in television news is when you have to shout out questions at the Prime Minister. You've all heard it on the telly. Are you going to resign, Prime Minister? I later learned that they never answer. So it's really about just saying something that is dramatic and most importantly, short. But my first attempt to Cameron, I was determined to ask some convoluted question about welfare policy. And I got ready. It was at party conference, I think in Manchester, actually. And as he walked out in front of all the clicking cameras, I started to shout. And then I froze because there was silence. No one else shouted. And everyone sort of turned to watch me. And all I said was, because I didn't dare carry on, Prime Minister, is this welfare? And then I stopped, and it was an awful Ali G moment. But anyway, I kind of got over that and I got better at it. I also covered the rise of Jeremy Corbyn within Labour, which was incredibly interesting because so many newspapers did not see it coming. But nothing has quite compared to Brexit and everything that has come since. Labour and Tory leadership contests through which you'd literally be running down the corridors of Parliament, kind of pressing your ear against a door where you know Tories are meeting together to plot, and then racing down another corridor where Labour MPs were tearing themselves apart. It really has been a roller coaster. And as you heard, on top of my Guardian job, I was also co-presenting with Robert Peston on ITV. 2.5 years ago, I moved over to the podcast, which I have to say has been a real career highlight for me. I work with amazing producers, still focusing heavily on politics, especially at the height of all the madness, but also about Black Lives Matter, the US election, the dark side of technology. And of course, so much has been about COVID-19. For me, it has meant turning a corner of my house upstairs into a DIY Blue Peter style studio. I've stuck foam on the wall. I've got a duvet hanging up to catch the sound. It's also been about trying to look after or homeschool 3 children while also working, a juggle that I'm sure many of you, or perhaps your parents, will recognise. And I've got lots more to say about that challenge. In fact, I can hear my children storming around right now. So I've got that slight nervousness that you've always got when you're a mum and you're on a meeting like this. And I also want to talk to you about my reflections on Manchester High and also my reflections on being a woman in the workplace. But I just thought I would pause here and take any questions if you've got some, and then I can carry on.
Okay, so many questions coming through, Anushka. Firstly, are you and Robert Peston, somebody wants to know, good friends outside of the Peston show?
We are, we're certainly, yeah, I get on very, very well with Robert. I would say, you know, my relationship with him is largely a professional one through that show, but it is very, very important, I think, when you're working that closely with someone to kind of get on, have a bit of chemistry, be able to chat. So yeah, I would say I'm quite close to him. I'm very, you know, the producers on that show, like on the podcast as well, are absolutely brilliant. So I spend a lot of time talking about politics to them.
What is the most surprising thing that you've learned throughout your career? What surprised you?
Sorry, got away. So there's actually something I was going to talk about later on, but I feel like it's an appropriate answer to this, which is what has surprised me is how complicated jobs are and how broad jobs are. And so, I was telling you about how Mrs. Robertshaw said, do you want to do English? And I thought, no, I can't write. And it didn't matter that I didn't think I could write for two reasons. Firstly, because you can learn to do anything. If there's one thing you're not feeling confident about age 14, you're going to learn to do it. But the second thing is, as you maybe could tell from what I've just described, 95% of my job was not about writing. 95% of it was about all the other things like communicating and meeting people and finding ideas. So I would say, is that the thing that's most surprised me? Well, that's certainly one of the biggest surprises, was how being a writer doesn't totally depend on being able to write, although you do need to learn how to do it. But because I've been on a news desk, I've actually looked at lots of writers' raw writing, and I'm not bad. I'm pretty good, I would say.
Brilliant. There's obviously been an awful lot of news over the last few years and a real focus on fake news. So from your point of view, how has that impacted journalism, your role? Has this, from your point of view, been positive or negative for journalism?
I think the rise of fake news has been extremely worrying. We all consume our media in a completely different way than we used to. And so say you're looking at your Facebook feed, you might get a story from The Guardian, and then you'll get a story from a source that you don't know where it's come from. And it could be saying something that is completely untrue. And we know now, at a time like the COVID crisis, how awful fake news can be. We see COVID deniers, for example. Recently, I interviewed a really amazing doctor who was working on a COVID ward, and she said she and her colleagues have to walk past COVID deniers shouting at them outside the hospital saying that COVID doesn't exist, and they just want to say, come in and let us show you. And that is because of fake news that has circulated. And so the real challenge for us in an organisation like The Guardian is, how can we show that we are trusted news and that is not trusted news? How can we show people that there is a difference between these sources? One of the things that is really kind of reassuring is that all the polls suggest that increasingly people do understand where they get trusted news from. And obviously, over the years, the kind of algorithms on social media have changed to try and push trusted news up. And certainly over the COVID crisis, more so than ever before, we are now seeing organisations like Facebook take down posts that are irresponsible. But I think it has been a huge, huge challenge to a lot of us. And people talk about the mainstream media now like it's a kind of dirty word in some parts of, or in some corners of the internet, and they say, why would we trust kind of professional journalists than we trust other people? And that is quite hard to take, because although I really think that community journalism is fantastic and people putting out their kind of information is fantastic, we also need to know that we can trust what we're getting, and that those people are getting their source, their information from somewhere else that they can trust. And I think one way that we as journalists have to try and improve on that trust issue is to be more open about our sources. So, when I started, half our stories were based on sources, and we wouldn't necessarily tell you where they were from. But now I think a lot more is expected of us to be very, very clear about where we get all our information from.
Really interesting. And obviously that has a massive impact on what we teach in schools too. Another great question has come in from Alice. Hi, Alice. Thanks so much for your helpful insight. She says she's been a local newspaper political reporter for almost 3 years now. Any advice for breaking into the nationals?
It's really hard, isn't it? And I was talking to another journalist about this recently who I was mentoring, who says that when you're outside a big organisation at the moment, it feels so hard, especially given what's happened through the past year with a lot of organisations making redundancies and cutting back on their freelance budgets. The route when I started was very much through local papers, and that has become less of a thing now because people come in through blogs and through other areas. But what I would say is that within politics, I think that is where you can start to move between different areas, because you've got a specialism, you must hold on to that specialism, and you must, oh, sorry, my lights are flashing. Can you see that? Sorry, give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to stop that light flashing. Sorry, it wasn't the children that got me in the end, it was the technology. And I would say, so when I used to work in the political team at The Guardian, we used to work in what was called Room 15 in the Houses of Parliament. And in our room would be the Yorkshire Post political correspondent. And every time I saw the person who was doing that job, they would eventually move on to the Nationals and then get very, very good jobs beyond that. And I think that what you can do as a local political reporter is you can know your MPs in a way that national reporters will never know them. And you've got to look for those stories that those MPs can give you. And you've got to really carve out that niche, and then you can pitch with those stories to the national newspapers. And hopefully, I don't know, Alice, if you're able to be in Westminster that much, but hopefully whilst there, try to build up contacts with other journalists. I think actually, once you're in the way that you're in, that is quite a kind of big step to have taken.
Okay, another question here. You mentioned how we increasingly consume our media and news in different ways. What do you expect future trends to be in this space? Does broadsheet journalism have a future? What do you think about challenging news outlets? You could probably talk about that for hours, but that's one question posed.
So that was another issue that I'm going to come to, and I will still come to it later. But the one thing I would say is that it's going to change dramatically, and we're all going to have to learn new ways of doing things. And I've really tried to embrace that in my career. You know, I have done Sunday papers, which are as traditional as you can get, and I've done podcasting, and I've done digital videos, and I've done live rolling news in TV. And when I moved from Sky News to The Guardian, it wasn't because I wanted to leave TV. When I came to TV, I thought, this is it, this is what I want to do. But what I thought was, the world of media is changing, and multimedia is going to be the future. And in the future, it's not going to be Sky News, ITV, BBC, and newspapers. It's going to be an organisation like The Guardian, operating across all the different mediums. So all operating across audio, TV, and print. And, you know, when I first joined The Observer, all we cared about was, are our stories in print? And, you know, I kind of laugh at that now, because when I write a story for The Guardian, it doesn't matter whether it's in print, because millions of people are going to see it on the website and far fewer are going to see it in print. In fact, more people listen to the podcast every day than buy the newspaper. That is how much the world has changed. Now, the thing that you've got to therefore take from this is that there's no point knowing absolutely right now how you be a how you be a particular type of broadcast journalist. So, for example, you know, there's no point just learning how to be on the news at 10, because the news at 10 might not be there in 10 years' time. I shouldn't say that, but, you know, it's an example. Print newspapers might not be there in however many times. So what you have to think about then is, how do I tell a story? And I've really learned that in podcasting, that it doesn't really matter what the medium is. The question is, how am I going to tell you a story about something that is happening? And so, you know, the skills that I use in podcasting are not I mean, obviously there's a bit of audio and audio editing and, you know, the way you speak, etc. But really it's about what matters about this story. And usually that is, number one, it's who does it affect and how does it affect them? So you're always trying to get to the heart of the story first. And then, you know, secondly, it's like, well, what facts can I bring to this story to try and bring it to life? And then thirdly, it's like, who can tell this story well? Is it a journalist, or do we need to try and speak to somebody who's involved in that journey? And that's the kind of decision making we're making all the time. So, for example, this week I'm doing a piece on, you know, should we be worried now that the AstraZeneca vaccine study suggests it's not quite as good against the South Africa variant? And on that, the person who can tell that story best and most simply is Sarah Bosley, our health editor, and we'll do it in a very simple way. But then next week, I'm going to do a piece about what's happening to asylum seekers in Napier Barracks, a kind of former army barracks. And in that, to tell the story, we need to speak to asylum seekers and we need to speak to doctors and we also need to speak to journalists. And so I think the way to think about it is to start with that idea of a story. And then hopefully in 20 years' time, the thing I promise you is not going to go away is that people are still going to need to be told stories, even if the way that we tell them and the platforms that we tell them through are totally different.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I've got lots and lots of questions to ask at the end, but perhaps we should carry on with your story, Anushka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So listen, I probably covered some of this in what I just said, so I'll try and kind of skip over those bits. But one thing I wanted to talk about was this COVID crisis, because we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about what parents make of it and how stressed we are. And I often think we don't really think hard enough about how children are feeling about it. And by we, I mean we, the journalists, not you, the schools, who are thinking about children all the time. And I recently tried to understand that a little bit better in a podcast that we dedicated to kids' voices, which was, you know, they were so incredibly articulate, you know, from very different backgrounds, but so articulate, and were telling me things that perhaps we don't always think about as adults in this. You know, I can't imagine what it must be like to be in year 7 and in a new school, maybe a big school that's quite scary and unable to make friends in the same way as you normally would because everything's online. And I can't imagine what it must be like to hit year 11 or year 13 and suddenly be told that the exams you've been working so hard towards aren't going to happen, or to go to university right now in such a different and difficult climate. I think, you know, we really need to think hard about what the long-term impact a lot of this is going to be on our children and the different experiences that they've had. It is a world away from our experiences, which we probably really took for granted at the time. And so I just kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of my experiences back then and just some reflections on Manchester High itself. And the first thing to say is that I'm incredibly grateful for what I got from school, from those history and Latin lessons that taught me not just, like I said, facts, but how to think and how to be creative. They have helped me to adapt through the world of work. And this really links to the question we just had. You know, I don't want to sound old here, but I left school in 1998 without email or a mobile phone. And, you know, as whoever just asked that question pointed out, the media landscape when I arrived at the Observer was totally different. You know, we didn't even think about writing for websites at the time, never mind blogs. You know, as I said, these days I wouldn't even check if a story was in print. And, you know, again, look at my career, moving from all these different platforms and ending up on a podcast. You know, the point I really wanted to make was one in a way that you've touched on, that in 20 years from now, this is going to change dramatically. And I think you should really appreciate those lessons that you're now having with different teachers, but the same sorts of lessons that are teaching you skills that you're going to apply in these very, very different environments. Because ultimately, the world of work is now changing so dramatically. I don't think teachers can teach to what it's going to be. They can only teach us to be equipped to deal with what it's got to be. And, you know, in that was that second point we touched on, which was never be put off with what you think your skills are as a teenager, because you're all going to go on, those of you who are at school, to do weird and wonderful things. I look around at my group of friends now and they are all doing fascinating jobs that I would never have been able to say for certain was what they would become when we were at school. You know, the world of work is really, really complicated and there's a lot of exciting jobs out there. You know, one of my best friends at school, Roisin, you know, we did Young Enterprise together. Well, actually, no, she didn't do Young Enterprise. I did Young Enterprise, which I loved. And then we set up a little business together when we were kind of 17, 18. And I always knew, that I could never be a business person and that she absolutely should be. And it's interesting to watch her kind of try to get towards that. You know, she went off and she became a ski instructor, and then she became a teacher. And now, you know, she is doing what she always wanted to do. She's setting up a business actually to sell kefir. And I said to her the other day, it was what you always needed to do from the days you were in Manchester High. And I think just kind of your work life will be really varied, and it could change a lot, and you could move jobs a lot and never feel that something is going to hold you back in that. The other really important thing that has shone through with all my friends who I discuss this with is that one of the most important things for us at Manchester High was this idea that as a girl and as a woman, we could do whatever we wanted. I mean, some of that is just the nature of a girls' school. You know, no one's telling me physics isn't for girls in Manchester High, or nobody's telling me chemistry isn't for girls. But, you know, I think it was more than that. And actually, my friend Adita raised this when I spoke to her recently. She said she didn't appreciate it until she left, but she certainly does now with 2 daughters, that sense that as a woman, nothing is off the table. And I think at Manchester High, that went way beyond it being an all-girls school. I actually thought it was because it was so steeped in history and that suffragette heritage. Like, I really grew up understanding that and thinking about that and understanding who the Pankhursts were. It certainly turned me into a feminist, and I can see that in my Manchester High peers, friends who have become teachers and health workers, lawyers, science documentary makers, but also people who I wasn't at school at the same time as. But just think about the alumni in my field, people like Catherine Mayer, who co-founded the Women's Equality Party, or amazing Emma Barnett. I mean, she was a bit younger than me. She was women's editor at the Telegraph. She wrote a brilliant and kind of really brave book on women's experiences, the ones we often ignore. And now she has the absolute dream presenting Woman's Hour. It doesn't totally surprise me that a woman like that came from this school. And, you know, for me personally, it has also been very central to my reporting and depressingly familiar along the way. 10 years ago, I was writing about the disproportionate impact of the financial crisis on women. And today I'm podcasting about the disproportionate impact of the COVID crisis on women. You know, we still have a situation in which the government puts out adverts with sexist depictions about the role of women, although happily, in this day and age, does pull them quite quickly when they notice that maybe it's not good to only have the women ironing, looking after the children, making dinner, etc. And depressingly, data from UCL says we are still 40 years off closing the pay gap. What would the Pankhursts think? And, you know, there are such challenges still in the workplace. And for me, I would say they've centred mainly around becoming a mother. You know, over the past decade, I have taken 3 maternity leaves, while some of my male colleagues continue to work long days, 5 days a week, building contacts, getting ahead. And now, you know, I struggle with so many women with the challenge of how to try to continue to be successful, continue to be ambitious, while also seeing enough of my children. And, you know, I think this is the challenge that explains why so many companies start to lose women at more senior levels, because by that time, many of us have had families and we become more nervous about those type of roles. And, you know, I talk about women, but really this is a problem that will only be fixed when we're talking as much about men in this same context, because they also need work-life balance. They also need to see their kids. And when they demand that as much as we have demanded it, then it will become much more normal for employers. You know, my husband actually faced the same challenges as me when, after we had our 3rd child, he decided to take some parental leave, so take part of the maternity leave and go down to 3 days a week for the kids. That was actually quite a hard thing for him to go through. And I think he probably experienced what a lot of women experience all the time. But on all of that, let me leave you on a positive note. And that is that to what is obviously a very difficult problem, there are so many solutions. And one that I experienced was when I took on the political editor role at The Guardian. myself and Heather Stewart went for the role as a job share. And I should tell you that before that, no woman had ever been political editor of The Guardian, and very, very few women had ever been political editor at any of the national newspapers. I think there'd been one at the Mirror and maybe one on a few on the Sunday papers. And that's because it's a really full-on job that on its own requires people to be working all day, every day, and that a lot of women, particularly when they become mothers, don't think that they want to do that and, you know, balance it with their families. And, you know, we were given an opportunity to make that work despite the position that we were in. And we both had very young children, because we said, we're going to do this together, you know, and my goodness, people stacked up potential problems for us. We had so many skeptical questions about who makes the decisions, who speaks to the news desk, who gets the byline. And for every difficult question we were asked, we found an answer. We talked it through. We found a way that would make it work, so that, you know, one day I was political editor and I made the decisions, even if Heather was there in the background and we were texting, and the next day she was. I mean, we had these bizarre days where, like, Heather went in the morning to cover the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq war while I went to sports day at the nursery. And then I would race across London at the end of sports day, and she'd hand over the baton and I would start writing about Boris Johnson's leadership bid as she ran home to a parents' evening or whatever it was. And so what I want to say is that I think there are solutions out there, that you have to be creative, that you have to be open-minded, and hopefully in 10 years, we won't be here repeating the same depressing statistics. That was everything I wanted to say, but I'm happy to take more questions.
Amazing, so fascinating, thank you. Lots of questions have come in. First one's really interesting. What can a school like Mhsg do to support the journey towards racial equality from your perspective?
You know, it's so interesting because we've been thinking about this so much over the past year, but it's also an issue that I've been thinking about throughout my career. In fact, when I began at the very beginning, I had a lecture when I was at university from an amazing Guardian writer. Unfortunately, he's left us now, but Gary Young, who had written just amazing stuff about race his whole career. And I asked for some advice on, you know, as a young BAME reporter, he advised, don't get pigeonholed too soon. Don't always write about race right from the start. But once you've got your job, once you're settled, then you can really do it. And so I spent a lot of my career trying to focus on writing about race, you know, from a personal perspective, but also in terms of how it was affecting people. But actually, what has really made me understand what you need to do to try and understand improving racial equality is this most recent role that I have been in, because one of my executive producers on the podcast, she's not BAME, but she kind of has it within her that this issue is always at the front of her mind. She's always thinking about diversity. And that doesn't actually only mean thinking about representation across different ethnic groups. It also means thinking about gender representation. And it also means thinking about having people who come from different parts of the country, because the media can get into a position where it's so kind of London based. And what I realized from her is that if you want to further racial equality, it has to be everywhere. It has to be in your thinking from the very beginning and at every turn. And if you don't think about it in that way, then I don't think you can break through with it. So I think that from school level, people need to be thinking about these things. They need to be thinking about why is it? And I don't know, of course, in an age appropriate way, you don't want to be showing young kids videos of George Floyd, but you do want to understand what happened and why it happened and what this uprising is. You know, I was thinking of trying to make a podcast about talking about race to my children, you know, to my children, primary age children, because we need to be thinking about racism right from the beginning and thinking about their identities and thinking about how that fits together and what it means for the world, and then thinking about how that combines with socioeconomic disadvantage as well, which is also incredibly important and is so badly underrepresented in the workplace. And so I think the way to do it is to be thinking and talking about it right from the start. And I'm sure in your history lessons now, you're having these, I bet you're having discussions about statues like, we were having discussions about other things when we were in the 90s. And, I don't want to criticize any schools, but I do know that I do think that, around where I am, I think the primary schools could do much more. I don't think it is absolutely at the front of their thinking. And beyond that is actually thinking about within schools itself. I was amazed. We did a podcast on racism within schools recently, and I was absolutely amazed about the things that came out that maybe the schools just didn't think about, like, whether it was a black girl and how she's allowed to wear her hair, or whether it is, the way that somebody might speak or react to something, just kind of things that it didn't even occur to me that would be happening within the education system. So I think also stamping things like that out and trying to kind of understand what has gone wrong in those situations. And then finally, I think that those of us who are older, you can't necessarily think in the way that younger people are thinking. So I think the other thing is to sort of almost be led by young people and by what they have to say. I was thinking about this recently, reading a story about another newspaper in America that has had to sack someone because they spoke really inappropriately when they were on a trip around with other people around issues of race. And at first they weren't punished at all. And it suddenly occurred to me that a kind of older, whiter management here had made decisions without even consulting how younger people might feel about that type of language. And just finally on that thought, language changes a lot. And the things that we heard in the 1990s and that might have even been acceptable in the 1990s might not be acceptable now. And sometimes that's hard. I've always used the word non-white to describe me. Now I'm told you're not allowed to use that. And to some extent, I find that hard and frustrating. But I think you have to understand that things change, and you have to change the way that you talk about things.
Thank you. I think the role of pupil voice in everything you've just spoken about is so important. There's been lots of questions about balancing children, which I think you've already spoken about. But there's another great question here about the impact of Mhsg and how it's influenced your personality in terms of confidence and the ability to take risks.
Well, in a number of ways. So obviously, I thought that kind of idea of womanhood, women's equality, like being it didn't matter, you could kind of achieve whatever you wanted, and to just really go for it was incredibly important. But also the experiences I had, particularly later on in the sixth form, like Young Enterprise that I mentioned, but also just like with this group of really kind of creative and interesting and innovative friends, kind of just doing things together that taught us so much beyond just what we'd learned in the classroom about the things that were going to be important in life. And I think that is one of the reasons that these friendships endure so much. And, I suspect you guys know from talking to alumni that this is not an unusual story, that you've got loads of friends still in your life who you met when you were at school, and those are the friends who I can turn to when I'm not sure about something in work terms, when I'm feeling like a bit underconfident about what I want to do next. I can pick up the phone to an old Manchester High girl and woman now and discuss that. And I think, that does make you more confident to take risks in life and to kind of, just go for it, and not necessarily because of a privilege thing. When I went to Cambridge, I'd come from a private school. I'd come from a, well-off family. My parents were doctors, but we were pretty down to earth, I think. When you looked around to some of the people I met from some of the schools at Cambridge, I'd never seen privilege like that and kind of overconfidence like that. But I never felt that at Manchester High. I never felt like I hope we never became arrogant. I think that there was a kind of down to earth friendliness about all of us that I did think lasted as well. So yeah, I think those.
There's a related question on that, I think. Do you think that preponderance of privately educated Oxbridge graduates in journalism is a problem?
I mean, yes, I think it is. And obviously I'm one of them. But the thing I think is you cannot represent the nation, which is what we're trying to do, if everyone you've got sitting around the table is from one single type of background. And, you know, so for example, I have written lots about the lack of female representation in politics, and that is a problem. Not just because it's good to promote women, not because women should be promoted ahead of men. And by the way, I get so frustrated when the responses you get are it should be done on merit. If it was done on merit, do you think that we wouldn't have 50-50 at least? Do you think that women are inherently less able than men? Clearly it's not done on merit. Something is done that means that women are not getting into the same positions at the same rate as men. And so the same for everything else. You know, if all we've got is privately educated people in a newsroom, if all we've got are people who've had this kind of experience of Oxbridge, then obviously we're not going to be doing enough of the type of stories that we should be doing in order to represent our readership. And so it's, you know, just on that very fundamental level, beyond another obvious argument for it, which is we've got to make sure that we have accessibility to everyone. And sometimes people will come from backgrounds where it's really hard. It's really hard to break through because they haven't learned the kind of, what is it? It's like the language, if you like, that you learn with a background like mine of how to get ahead in different environments. And so I always remember I judge a annual competition at The Guardian called the Hugo Young Award, where we have journalist students write pieces of essays, basically, that we then go on to publish. And I'll always remember this one that we had of a guy who he wrote actually about being homeless in Tameside, which is where I grew up, and he wrote about the experience of living on the streets and then being helped out of that situation. And he, you know, his name was Danny, and it just absolutely punched you in the gut. And it wasn't beautifully written, it wasn't perfectly written, but it was so raw and it was so brilliant. And, you know, that guy would never have had access to an organisation like The Guardian. And when he won the award, got his piece published, but when he initially came into work experience, I think he found the whole experience quite discombobulating, because basically he you know, he suddenly had to wear like a tie in a situation that he wasn't used to wearing a tie, or he had to speak a certain way, and he wasn't sort of used to these things. And, you know, in certain times you might have just dismissed that person's opportunity to get ahead, but he was really supported, he was really helped to get ahead at The Guardian. And he's called Danny Lavelle, and he went on to do this absolutely, I mean, he does loads of extraordinary journalism, but he went on to do this absolutely extraordinary series with another of our amazing journalists, Simon Hattonstone, on homelessness in the UK, and it won Best Feature at the British Journalism Award. It is, you know, it was so highly rated, and I think you cannot replicate having people's experience put into their work. And, you know, for Danny to have literally been so down and out that he was living on the streets, and to get to where he is now is just not only amazing and the right thing to do, but so enriching for our journalism. And, you know, that said, I don't think if you have that amazing experience, I don't think, you know, if somebody comes from a really difficult background and gets into Oxbridge, we should be, you know, not getting them into these great jobs. I just think we have to make sure that it is open, it is accessible, it is fair. I think we have to make sure that we are judging people in a way that is fair, because, you know, we know this on gender especially, people hire in their own image. So, you know, if all you've got are loads of Oxbridge graduates from a certain kind of type of background, then, you know, there is a risk that they start to hire people who sound and look and think like them. And so, you know, it's really important, for example, that we have diverse, diverse interviewing panels for when we're hiring people. You know, I saw that when me and Heather got the job at the lobby for The Guardian, we wanted to hire loads of women because we were probably hiring in our own image, and we saw kind of young, ambitious women, and we thought, oh yeah, we definitely want them. And at one point we were like, we need to hire some men. So, you know, I think it is kind of, it's quite complicated, but both because it's the right thing to do, but also because it enriches our work. I think that we should be always trying to make sure that we get a mix. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right, at the moment in the media, it is far too kind of monoculture.
There's a couple of associated questions come up with that. Did you ever feel actively disadvantaged being a woman of colour working in a dominantly white male industry? So has that ever impacted you in your career?
You know, weirdly, I actually sometimes think the opposite, which is that I came into, but there's a big caveat here. I don't think that it means that women of colour are suddenly getting loads of opportunities. But, you know, I came into the Observer on a programme that was trying to help people of colour or people from ethnic minorities. And so maybe I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I hadn't have been a woman of colour. And then once you're in the door, then things really open up for you. And then, you know, as someone who's successful and who is also, you know, an Asian woman, actually, I find often people are looking for people like me because they've got too few people like me. But, and it's a really big but, and there's two big buts to it, in fact. One, I was a woman of colour with a fairly privileged background. So really, was I the right person that the scheme should have been helping at the time? And secondly, so few people with my background break in. And so you end up in a situation where you feel like the token face. Because I go on trips with the Prime Minister, say, with the lobby journalists, and there's hardly anyone of colour there. Hardly anyone. I mean, you look at the press conferences, you watch on TV, you tell me how many times there's somebody who's BAME there asking a question of the Prime Minister. Hardly ever. And, you know, we are still in a situation where, you know, there's so much more to do and it's so hard to do it. In terms of like you know, have I faced racism? And not from my colleagues, but I've often been out on stories where I have had to face kind of questions about those sorts of issues. So, for example, you know, I spent a long time early on in my career writing about the BNP Triangle, as it was called, an area in East London where there was a lot of far right activity. It was not a very comfortable place to go as an Asian woman. And I found people obviously were less willing to talk to me. So I have had experiences like that in my reporting. And that has been really hard, but not from colleagues.
Great, thank you. Possibly our final question, but a few people have asked about what's next for you. You've had a fascinating career so far, but do you have another passion that you would like to pursue in the years ahead?
Do I have another passion? Look, I mean, what I think is I have had an amazingly exciting and varied career. I have sort of jumped around and done lots of interesting things, and they've all been fantastic, and I've really enjoyed them. I think there's a lot to be said for specialising. And in fact, the Saturday editor of the Times, when I used to work at the Times, once said to me, "You've got that political specialism. Don't forget that, because that's really important." And you know, in some ways, I have stepped a little bit back from that in the podcast, and I do want to try to make sure that I'm still on top of that politics, which I obviously do through the ITV role. But you know, the thing I've been thinking about recently, and maybe this is your typical midlife crisis, is that I'm 40, and in 10 years I'll be 50. And it may be that in 10 years I will want to do something quite different. And it may be that I also will find it harder to get the type of jobs that sort of fell into my lap through my 20s and 30s. And so I've been thinking more that in the future, not now, I need to be in a position where I'm prepared to and able to do things that might be a bit more different, that might be less on screen and perhaps more kind of behind the scenes, managerial type stuff. And so, yeah, I am open to things. I'll just continue to love journalism. I think I've got a lot of expertise in journalism, and I think I've got a lot of expertise in politics. So I'm quite open to my career changing in a different direction in the future. But at the moment, I just love doing what I'm doing. And as I often say to people, I mean, imagine if for your job, you have to wake up every morning and speak to interesting people about interesting things. I have to say I am pretty lucky. And so, you know, I'm just going to appreciate every moment that I still have that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We're so sorry if we didn't get to your question. We've had so many questions. I think it's an excuse for you to come back. But thank you so much for such a fascinating and insightful presentation. You know, what's so lovely is to hear about the ongoing impact of MHSG on your life, the friends you made, the teachers you were inspired by, and the fact that you talked about the importance of grabbing opportunity, making the most of experience, perseverance and aiming high, you know, everything that we would want for our current students. It's such an inspiring message for us all. And as Helen said on the chat, you are a brilliant public advocate for MHSG. So thank you, Anushka, and to everyone for joining us this evening. It's been such a fabulous virtual founders lecture. So thank you so much, Anushka, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us.